This is the story of two journeys. The first begins nearly 150 years ago with the birth of Joseph Mesure, whose travels and adventures laid the foundation for the future generations of the Lubert family. Because of Joseph, the Luberts, or Lubetskis as they were known in Eastern Europe, have survived persecution, emigration, 2 world wars, and all the struggles immigrants must face to grow and flourish into the large and successful family they are today. The second journey is Danny's. Together with 2 of his sons, Jacob and Joseph, Danny set out to discover what he could about his family's origins and to retrace the steps of his great-grandfather from Poland through Belarus and to the UK and beyond.
Well, we've always had a feeling that there's, a powerful story behind the Lubert side of the family, but it's been different versions of it. So what was important for me was to get the facts and, be able to impart that information to everyone, not just myself and my immediate family, but to the whole Lubert clan. And at the same time, to get a personal feel for the story. 2.5 years ago, so July 2009, I was ill, quite nastily ill, and had a big shock. And I think it gave me a bit of a wake-up call because I knew the Lubert thing. I wanted to do it, but I think it was having had that nasty period where I had to stay in England. I couldn't go back to Dubai. I was here for an extra 3 months to get better. That then kind of pushed me into action, and I thought, no, I need to do it now.
Joseph was born in Bialystok around 1868. Russia had expanded to envelop Poland during this period, so Bialystok was by then a part of Russia. Joseph was raised in one of the city's Jewish orphanages. At this time, Bialystok had a thriving Jewish community, comprising nearly 70% of the population, and featured several prestigious synagogues. While still very young, Joseph was drafted into the Tsar's army, but deserted and made his way to Mir in Belarus, where he settled and married Sophie Lubetsky in 1888.
He was from Białystok in Poland. We know he was at a Jewish orphanage. Białystok, like a lot of the big cities in Poland, were just flattened, completely flattened in the Second World War, so there's no records of anything. So we know he would have been in one of 3 or 4 orphanages. One reason or another, he came from Białystok to Mir, where there was a very famous yeshiva, which is a Jewish place of learning. And he came there. We're not sure if he came there because he'd deserted or because he just wanted to find, a new life for himself. And there he met Sophie Lubetsky, and they got married and immediately were clever enough to move to England. He changed his name to Lubetsky because anything with a ski on in Poland is quite a noble name. He might have adopted her name also because he may have deserted.
We're on a small chartered jet on the way to Minsk in Belarus, and today we're going to take a look around Minsk and see what happened back all those years ago.
And we lived in a place where there was endless blocks, all exactly the same. And after a few drinks, coming home and trying to explain to the taxi driver where you lived.
Trying to recognise things.
Yeah, it was just impossible, hours.
Because communication is so poor, you could do that, you could disappear if you wanted to.
Your great-grandfather was a deserter, but I think I would have deserted. Went to Mir and got the owner's daughter.
We are sitting in the car, heading to Mir, where we're gonna hopefully find some interesting things about our family's past. And Joseph Lubetsky, we've got the same name, but for some reason I feel more inclined and interested to see how his life went on from when he moved to Mir to become a sweet maker. Yeah, I just feel like I really want to understand how he lived his life. I hope we find what we're looking for when we came here, which is our family's history.
Mir in the 19th century was a small town of 5,000 people, mostly Jewish. Despite its size, it boasted a famous yeshiva, or Jewish school.
Do you think that Joseph Lubetsky and Sophie Lubetsky went in that building?
Joseph definitely.
Yes.
Sophie might not have been allowed.
Yeah, yeah.
Funny enough. But Joseph was definitely gone in there as part of the community. This
And how old he was, what, in his 20s here?
Yeah. Quite possibly just in his early.
No Jews at all in this town now? This is the records of the people that received grants when their houses burnt down.
Yeah.
And
This is 1894, so I think.
and there's some Lubetskys in there.
Lubetsky, Theodor. And here, Lubetsky, Levitso.
Leona.
Leon, yeah.
Touretz is a small town 8 miles northwest of Mir. In 1897, just under half of its population of 1,600 people were Jewish. Joseph became a confectioner here, but the young couple emigrated to the UK shortly after their marriage to escape the pogroms and persecutions that plagued the Jews in Eastern Europe during that time.
Коня держали. Вот.
Now he knows exactly where the Lubetskys live, because he asked what businesses they had. I told him, so they had a horse, he remembers, their house stood right here, he says.
Exactly where?
Покажите это место, пожалуйста. Давайте. He says that there used to be a small moat here just to step over. The house stood right here, and the entrance door into the house was exactly from the lane.
Being here in Mir, where some of our family members actually lived, and some of them died. It's amazing.
That's basically the story of the lineage. We left Luberts behind on my great-grandmother's side, and they're the ones who went on to become, to get killed in Touretz or in Mir, to go on and escape and to join the partisans. And we took Sophie Lubetsky and Joseph, who was Mazur, now Lubetsky, came here, and off they went and multiplied.
For a young, poor immigrant family at the turn of the 20th century, London was a daunting place. The city teemed with industry and the millions of workers required to run its enormous docks, factories, and the thousands of shops and pubs that kept this vast capital city alive.
The late 1800s, 1892 I think it was, when Joseph and Sophia Lubetsky came over. I think it was chaos. I think they were under the fear of death from the pogroms back in Poland, that became Belarus. And so it was getting to somewhere safe, primarily either here or to the States. And so getting to London, the arrival hall of London was the East End, Mile End, Whitechapel, all around there. And so I just imagine it was, you had a few contacts, people that were already there, you had very little money, you were squeezed into houses. And I think it was, just trying to survive. But I think the Jewish community provided a little bit. I think there were soup kitchens, there were soup kitchens, and there was also the shuls, the synagogues, and various other associations. So I think there were some places to get help, but general, I would say it was dirty, horrible, chaotic survival.
There was a lot more Jewish people, and it was a very different society, a lot more community, going to the synagogue. Marriage was a lot more important back then. Daily jobs, tailors, teachers, just everything was different. Jobs, the way people lived, what people did for entertainment, travel, and also value of money, very different back then.
I think the Jewish immigrants, as a whole, were very industrious. They worked hard, they saved, and they became educated, they did okay. A lot of the Jews did okay, and as you know now, I mean, here and in America, are some of the most powerful people, and from those immigrants, you know, 100 years ago. So I think they struggled initially, you know, in settling and learning the language, because the language was a big thing. I mean, my great-grandparents didn't speak English. They had to learn it when they got here. Ginny Bronstein, who became Lubertsky, she was born in Ukraine, so she had to learn English. So I think the language was a big thing. And of course, you know, the names were lost in translation, as we all know. So I think getting an identity was the big struggle, but once you got that, you worked hard and you looked after your own, and there was a community there, and I think the Jews got by. A lot of them went into the rag trade, the diamond trade, you know, jewellery.
Like almost all Jewish immigrants, Joseph and Sophie settled in the East End, at first in Ellen Street, Mile End. It was cheap to live here, and despite the poverty and slum conditions, there was a strong sense of community. Many other Jewish families lived in the area, and there was work to be had. The London Metropolitan Archive is one of our greatest resources for research into the early part of the 20th century. It contains millions of files relating to life during this period, and has a set of colour-coded maps that trace population movements and centres of ethnic culture. Joseph made his living working as a Hebrew teacher when he could. Their first son, Harris, was born in 1891 in Mile End. He was named after Herschel, Sophie's father. Soon afterwards, the family moved to Plumbers Row and had their second son, Aaron Samuel, in 1893. The two boys were followed by Lazarus in 1896, Michael in 1899, and finally a daughter, Fanny, in 1902. The family was growing rapidly during this time. According to family anecdotes, Sophie was quite a fearsome woman who made ends meet by selling what she could in the markets. Her children behaved well as they feared her sharp tongue. Joseph, in contrast, was a quiet, gentle man, and everyone who knew him spoke of him with great affection. Sophie's sister Sarah married Barnett Langer, a cap maker, at the East London Synagogue in Rectory Square. They lived in Fashion Street off Brick Lane in two adjoining houses.
They witnessed their own weddings. That's the second one.
No, they've signed and they're in the presence of this person.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
The interesting thing here is that we've got the mark of Sarah Lubertsky, and most of the Lubetskys don't sign with a mark, because if they have a mark, it's because they can't read and write, whereas the others don't do marks.
Joseph was a confectioner and made sweets back in Poland, and when he came to London, him and Sophia started working at the shul. They were involved in real traditional Jewish professions. He was translating from Hebrew to English. She was a clerk in the synagogue, and her sister was married to the fabricants, and her sister and her brother, and her, Sophia, and her husband, Joseph, and their 10 children between them, lived together in the 2 up, 2 down house in Frederick's Place.
The turn of the century brought more wealth and security to the family, and by 1911 they had moved to Frederick Street in Bow, a more prosperous area. The street is now called Aberavon Road.
There's probably a kosher breakfast.
19.
What number is
it? 21.
2.
23. 25.
28, yeah.
Okay, so should we get out and have a look at
definitely.
We are at my great-grandfather's house that he lived with his sister's husband and their family. 14 people in this, 1 kitchen, 1 lounge and 2 bedrooms upstairs.
The 3 older Lubetsky sons were now working. Harry as a clerk in a shipping office, Sam as a shop assistant in a drapery warehouse, and Lazarus as a jeweller's shop assistant. Michael and Fanny were at school, and Sophie stayed home to run the family house. As the First World War broke out, the young Lubetskys were growing up quickly. In 1914, Sam Lubetsky married Jenny Broomstein at the East London Synagogue. They moved to Hatton Garden, and within 2 years they had their first child, Rennie. Jenny Lubetsky gave birth to Montague, Monty Lubetsky, Danny's father, in 1917 in Newcastle Street, Whitechapel. At this time, Harris, who had changed his name to Henry Lubert, was drafted into the US Army. His younger brothers, Sam and Lou, Lazarus, followed his example and all fought during the Great War. Sam was discharged in 1919 on medical grounds, probably resulting from gas attacks during the fighting. By 1921, the Lubetsky family, or Luberts as they were now known, had moved to Culverston Crescent in Dalston. The house was much bigger, and Dalston was again a step up from Bow. Lazarus, now Louis Lubert, married Gertie Friedman and had a daughter a year later. In 1923, Sam took off for America. In a letter to his brother Lou, he simply remarked that he was sailing to the US on Friday. That year, Lou had his first son, Bernard. A shadow fell over the family the following year with the death of Sam, aged only 30. Sam had contracted TB and left his small 4 children fatherless. It seems likely that his illness was caused by his gassing in the First World War. Monty, Renee and Queenie were all admitted to the orphanage in Norwood, where they grew up. Sophie died in 1929, still a young woman herself. She left £135 in total for her many children and grandchildren. Joseph married 2 years later. With his new wife, he moved to Casanova Road, Stoke Newington. Monty left the orphanage in 1931 to take up a scholarship. He became politically active and was involved in the fight against British fascism in the 1930s.
You know, my dad was a communist, but my dad and his sisters were members of the Communist Party, as well as being Jewish. And my dad was, you know, he was only a small man, but he was a powerful, quite aggressive small man, and you know, he used to go down and fight black shirts. He'd go and fight with Oswald Mosley's crew on a Sunday morning, you know, in the East End. So yeah, definitely, I do know about that. You know, he was a very staunch Jew. You know, he supported what he believed in.
Altogether, 84 rioters are taken into custody, while the police firmly prevent the battle from taking an uglier turn. 80 injured are taken to hospital. Hundreds more receive first aid on the spot. From impartial people, the police earn nothing but praise. So does Sir Philip Game in banning the march. Firm action by the Commissioner and his men undoubtedly averted bloodshed on a scale more terrible than London has ever witnessed.
Joseph died in 1937 and was buried at Edmonton Cemetery. His bold adventure had paid off, and even though his life had been marked by tragedy, he had firmly established the British Luberts and set them on the ladder towards success and wealth. By 1939, Jenny and her family were living in a flat above a shop in Leather Lane off Hatton Garden.
So this is our grandma's shop?
Yeah, this is where she worked really hard.
Was it her? It was her shop though? She had the lease?
Yeah.
My mum used to live here.
Yeah.
And my grandmother had the shop and the stall. But that was in the war, in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, no. Yeah, this guy over here was telling me that. Yeah, that your mum and dad.
So the flats don't come with the shop now?
No.
They lived upstairs. His mum and our grandparents. I think they must have had the first floor flat.
Yeah. That's a long time ago, obviously.
Was the shop smaller than this before?
I think it was. I think it just came to there.
I don't know. I don't remember it.
Have you been here then?
Yeah, I have been. Yeah.
Have you?
Yeah, but I was only like 5 or 6, so I don't really remember it.
Thank you. See you later. No problem.
By the 1930s, Poland was home to the largest Jewish population in Europe and served as the centre for Jewish culture. A diverse population of Jews from all over Europe sought refuge in Poland, contributing to a wide variety of religious and cultural groups. Before the outbreak of World War II, more than 3.3 million Jews lived in Poland. Barely 11% survived the war. At this time, there were 400,000 Jews living in Belarus, about 8% of the population. Life for these Jewish populations became harder after the end of the First World War. Jews were blamed for communist insurrections, and there were waves of pogroms across the region. Jews also found themselves barred from many professions, such as banking and the civil service. Despite these hardships, emigration had tailed off during this period, and the Jewish communities grew and thrived. It was the calm before the storm that was to come.
We went out to Mir, which is where the yeshiva was, which is where Joseph and Sophia met. And it's basically a ghost town, as are all the old, they called them shtetls, which is a small Jewish community or village. It doesn't have to be all Jewish, but where there's a large population of Jews, shtetl, and they're all ghost towns in Belarus now, what was Poland, because no one wanted to stay there. All the Jews either got killed or escaped, and they're never going to go back. And anyone who stayed around, it's just an awful place. So you'll find you go to these places and they're horrible. The memory, you can still smell, it's still there.
With the outbreak of the Second World War, Monty promptly enlisted for the army, where he served as a private until the end of the war. War was hard for Londoners during the Blitz. The East End's proximity to the docks made it an important target for the Luftwaffe, and it received a harder share of the bombing than other parts of London. One night, Jenny and the family emerged from the tube where they had been sheltering to discover that Leather Lane was on fire and they had lost everything they owned. But despite the hardships and danger, Britain remained safe from invasion. The story was very different in Poland and Belarus. Warsaw was flattened and then invaded in 1939. Poland was soon overrun by the Nazis, who immediately rounded up the large Jewish populations and herded them into ghettos to starve and die from the dirt and disease in these overcrowded warrens. The ghettos were hellish places to live. In Warsaw, 450,000 Jews were walled off into a slum area of just over a square mile. 75,000 people died of disease, but if someone was too sick to work, they received no food tickets and would die of starvation. The Nazis told the Jews that there was work for them in better places out in the country, and so many people stepped onto the death camp trains, hoping for a better outcome. They were to die in Auschwitz, Treblinka, and the other camps.
Jews were never killed in Germany. So the Nazis would export the Jews out of Germany and tell them they're going, they've got jobs for them, work for them, get all your stuff, great news. We've got work for you in the outposts of this growing region that was all controlled by Germany. They would make them pay for their own tickets, and then they would take them to places like Warsaw, Minsk, where they would basically go into a concentration camp or a ghetto and eventually be killed. The Warsaw ghetto was the biggest ghetto. That's where most of the Jews were killed. I think 3 million Jews were killed there. I know the first summer, half of the Jews in the Warsaw ghetto died of starvation or disease because they weren't fed and there was no medical supplies. So it's a very important place to visit in terms of the Holocaust, because that was the centre of where the Nazis used to take, and they'd go from there to Auschwitz or wherever they were going to go to.
The Nazis occupied Belarus in 1941. They immediately began rounding up the Jews for either work or extermination. The Minsk ghetto held over 100,000 Jews. They were allotted 1.5 metres of living space per person and none for the children. A handful of people survived the ghetto and its destruction, but most either starved or were shot and buried in huge pits. By the end of the war, over 3 million Belarusians had died, over 40% of the population.
For some background information, we looked at Minsk, which was quite a big ghetto, and there was a place called the Pit, where they had to walk down these steps where there were no handrails, quite steep steps, down into this pit, naked, made them take all their clothes off. And then when they got down, they'd just shoot them, and they just used to cover them in lime and earth, and they would just rot, basically. But we saw this most incredible sculpture, which was done by a Jewish sculptor, and it was just incredible.
I myself knew a man who was a 6-year-old boy from the orphanage, who was also brought here for being killed, but he was not killed immediately. He was so frightened that he simply fell down, and he stayed in the pit, covered with those killed, till very late at night. And only when he did not hear any shots, and when it became quite dark, only then he dared to climb out. And now imagine, what could do a small boy undressed, and where could he go?
Well, how sad it was of all these Jews being marched into the pit and being killed. But the big thing for me on that large graveyard was all the memorials and the flowers from the Germans trying to come and say sorry. It was really, I don't know why, I don't know if anyone else finds that sad. I just welled up and was in tears. I just thought all these young Germans coming over and just their memory. Imagine if that was us and our parents had been involved in that, how ashamed we would be. And what a sad thing the whole thing is, that people today are still trying to make amends, still suffering. It's, you know, what an awful thing. Some, you know, a large group of evil people created. So that's what came up for me. And the boys, that was their first contact with Holocaust, the shock of a systematic destruction of a genocide of a race of people. That was the first time I think they ever really took it on board that that was what was going on.
Jewish community was gathered on this marketplace behind this pink building and before the church. And they were ordered to take warm clothing, gold, money, documents. And they were saying that we'll take you to some construction site for work. But Nazis just picked up the strongest, the youngest 40 men because they were afraid that they will organize resurrection, and they took them from this marketplace and shot them. First of all, they were killing people who couldn't work, and these 900,000 were just professionals, artisans, shoemakers, doctors, those people, professionals who can work. After that, in spring 1942, they're taking them to Mir Castle, and on the 13th of August 1942, all of them were shot. But some people just managed to survive because the resistance group was organized in Mir Ghetto.
So basically they tried to kill every single Jew in this town?
Yes. Nobody had a chance.
Are these all Jewish prisoners?
These are all Jewish.
Mind your head. So they've had to put the armbands on or not?
Yeah. So she's got.
In Mir, all the Jews were locked up in the castle at Mir, which was owned by an old noble family, and the guy in charge, the German officer in charge of that castle, was actually Jewish, and no one knew. So he created some sort of diversion where he sent the army away from the castle and then basically let all the prisoners out. A lot had been killed, but the survivors out, and there were some Luberts in there, I think 6, and they went on to join the partisans, and they're mentioned in the book, they're listed. And the guy who let them out, he didn't get sentenced to death, he went to prison, and he became a monk, he became a Christian.
They were told to bring all their belongings and their warm clothes, so any furs, any decent clothing they had. So basically, bring all your stuff that we're going to want. We're going to pretend you're going to go and get some construction work.
Yeah.
And then they take them to kill them.
Yeah.
This is the bit I don't understand, and I suppose the reason they did that is because they didn't want them panicking.
That's right, it's control.
Yeah.
It's controlling right from the very moment. They'd get the local leaders of the village and say, right, this is what we're going to do. Go and tell your people this is what we're going to do. Of course, normal people trusted their village elders, the rabbi and everything like that. So they said, okay, if the rabbi says it's okay, it must be okay. He's never lied to us in his life. Why is he going to lie?
Tourette's, which had been a tiny sleepy town before the war, had more than its share of tragedy. A ghetto was constructed for local Jews who were forced to work as craftsmen in unsanitary conditions on starvation rations. Many of the local Christian population were sympathetic to the plight of their Jewish neighbours, and witnesses to the events that befell the town are still alive today.
They were ordered to get undressed. They were just in their underwear, and they were made to run to the pit. A man, that killer from Stolpci, he was lying behind a submachine gun and was shooting.
Meeting Pavel in Tourette's, who saw, as a 9-year-old, 500 Jews in his village being shot dead. Seeing children stripped of all their clothes, sent in one queue, adults in the other. And him reliving that, having a first-hand description of what went on. I don't mean that, oh, it was great. I just mean from a emotional and powerful thing, and just stunning to hear someone actually, stunning in the sense that it stuns you, to hear someone relate that story as a 9-year-old.
I remember walking up to the site in Tourette's and seeing there was 2 graves. On one side there was a grave for children and on the side for adults. And I mean, seeing a grave where possibly hundreds of Jewish children would have been slaughtered and laid there was really, really upsetting. And we placed these flowers on the thing and a stone as well. It was upsetting, to say the least.
And then the lady who showed us round, who we went to meet in Tourette's before we met Pavel, her husband, she met us, and there's footage of her, not enough footage, but there is some, and she was in her Sunday best. And her husband was 90, and he couldn't speak 2 words about what happened, and he just started crying.
He didn't witness himself the massacre because his father didn't let children go anywhere. Kept them just at home to be safe. So they were friendly with everybody. Почему вы сейчас растрогались так? Почему вы плачете? Because he has such a heart. Because he has such a heart, he just remembered what happened. Well, when he watches even on TV.
It was just amazing that when I tell you these ghost towns are haunted by what went on. and it's never going to go till everyone's dead who was around there or saw it. It's not going to be cleansed because they're cursed with it. And it was like it happened yesterday to him, and it happened 50 years ago. It was awful, but very emotional.
This building is an original building from the pre-war time. It used to be workshops, stables for the original courthouse. They arranged a labor camp here, and the rooms you enter now are the rooms where the Jews lived more than 1 year. You know what was the ration here? 125 grams of bread a day and a plate of soup cooked from potato peels. How could you escape? The guards were walking along the fence all the time. Tunnel was a very good idea, you know, for those who wanted to escape and for those who didn't want to escape. Imagine how many people lived here, in what conditions they were, and you decide to dig a tunnel. Okay, how? You have no tools. We found a spade and these self-made nails during archaeological research here. Not many Jews believed, but still 200 Jews escaped from the ghetto. I know that 60 were caught and killed because a group of 60 people was hiding near Mir. But normally when the escapes took place, people escaped in small groups, and everybody was to find their own way to the partisans. So we know that 4 Lubetskis reached the Belskis in the forest. This is actual entrance, but it's not the proper depth. It was 2 meters deep, and then the tunnel ran 1 meter under the surface. You know how narrow the tunnel was? 65 centimeters wide and 70 centimeters high. They couldn't walk, they could only crawl, and it was difficult to dig the tunnel in a lying position.
How long did it take to dig the tunnel?
Good question. They began after the massacre in the second half of May 1943, and the escape took place on September 26. 4 months.
For Jews who were lucky enough to escape capture by the Nazis, or who had actually managed to break out of a ghetto, there was almost nowhere to go. Ordinary people were rewarded for turning them in, or could face execution for sheltering a Jew. But in the midst of this horror there was a ray of hope. The 4 Belsky brothers from Stankovici, although regarded as thugs by their pre-war contemporaries, took to the huge forests and established a Jewish partisan camp from where they not only harassed and attacked Nazis, but were able to find and save over 1,200 fugitive Jews. The Belsky brothers became legendary, living as outlaws, moving from camp to camp as the Germans moved closer. They managed to survive the entire war with almost no casualties. They have become heroes to the families they rescued, and among their company were several Lubetskis.
I realised this is what they used to travel around in, and we sat and we listened to the music and we went out into the middle of nowhere. And we looked at how they used to live. They used to dig into, basically dig into the earth and make a cave, really, a mud cave. And, their fires, they used to build tubes of wood, and they used to lay them out, over hundreds of yards, and the smoke would be pumped in there, and with all little holes along, so it dissipated very gradually, and so you couldn't see trails of smoke or plumes of smoke coming up, so they couldn't be found. So it was very interesting, and we spent so long there that that's what ended up making us late, leaving the Belarusian border to try and get into Poland. But no, it was great, and the food was good, and the vodka was ridiculously strong.
Oh.
That's the village where the Belsky brothers were from, and they were 2 tough guy brothers. I think there might have been 3 brothers, but 2 main ones, tough guys, not very respected by the Jewish community, seen as thugs, uneducated, dodgy, bit bandits. That's how they were perceived until the Nazis occupied, and they became the heroes because they escaped, and formed a group of people called the Partisans.
We'd all rather be here than being in a restaurant, because you can actually imagine, just like all the other places we've been, you can imagine the Belskis and our family and all the families which came to the forest in aid of the partisans, and they just live in these houses, they drink here, they have fun, they make songs, they do have parties. And this specific area was the crossover from I think the Yemen River or something like that, and this is where most people would come. They'd camp here because they'd be tired, obviously, after a journey, because you don't have cars and stuff here. And so we've probably been in places, in the rooms here, where the Belsky brothers and the Lubetskis have most definitely probably stayed.
It doesn't really feel like a tour, it feels kind of like an emotional journey. We're standing in the footsteps of our relatives and our family, our bloodline. The ghettos, that's something that I really would not like to have experienced myself. But I guess, as much as it is, something so horrible and disgusting, it also provided, that need to get out of there, and that, that it made them want to rebel and want to get out of there and start these partisans. And if they hadn't, then there would have been a lot more deaths. So I guess if the conditions had been nicer, more people would have died.
What was it?
Jacob.
Mhm.
Where's my sister?
Just eat something at the beginning and then...
Obviously, sort of got a claim to fame, knowing that they were part of the Belsky group of partisans.
It made me feel quite proud, to be honest, that members of our family had, escaped from the ghetto and gone on to make it through the war. And yeah, maybe I've got a bit of that power in me too.
London was transformed in the years following the victory over Germany. As large parts of the East End had been razed to the ground, there was an urgent need for housing. The old narrow streets and tenements which had survived the Blitz were mostly demolished to make way for council housing, which took the form of tower blocks or streets of cheaply made houses and flats. Many East Enders moved away permanently, and the old sense of community was mostly just a memory. It was a hard time to make a living. Monty was a trombone player and played with several well-known bands of the era, but despite being described at one point as Young Musician of the Year, gigs were few and far between, and money was always tight. In 1950, while walking on an icy street, Jenny Lubert fell and hit her head. Although she had severe concussion, it went undiagnosed at the hospital and she died of her injuries over the weekend. She was 58. Monty was heartbroken and never fully recovered from his mother's tragic death.
She'd gone to the pictures on her own, and she came out of the pictures somewhere near Shepherd's Bush, I think. And one version of the story is someone bumped into her and she fell. Another version of the story, she slipped. So the official report is she slipped, but some of our family have said she complained she was bumped into by a group of people. She banged her head, she went home, she didn't feel well. She went round to my dad's house, who was with his wife Shirley Lubert at the time, and she stayed there. My dad called the doctor. The doctor came, took one look at her and took her to the hospital, St Mary's at Paddington. And she had all the signs of a concussion, of some and a hemorrhage, a bleed on the brain. But they didn't do anything about it. They didn't, release the pressure. So she went into a coma and died in the middle of the night in the hospital. And Pete and I were saying, my cousin, that why wouldn't they don't have to drill a hole? And it's as simple as that, to take the pressure away and to let the bleed come out. And we can't understand what happened.
Low point, not low point from the point of view of disappointment, but the really sad bit is looking at Bubba, Jenny Lubetsky's post-mortem stuff, where it's so sad that she died so young and I never really had a chance to know her, but also that there seems to be very little that they did for her in the hospital. they knew and suspected straight away that she had a fractured skull, but they don't seem to have made any attempt whatsoever to relieve the pressure or help her. And I don't know whether that's because they didn't do it in those days. It wasn't a medical process they were used to. But it just seems very sad that she was lying there with this condition caused by a fall, and that, you know, they didn't do anything. They just left her there to go into a coma, and then she died. So it was pretty gruesome reading that.
He was very melancholy about his mum, and I remember coming in from school one day, and he was in. We had the lounge, and we had a curtain and a dining room with what had the music, and he was sat at one of the chairs of the dining room, crying. You know, and I'm like a 13-year-old, 12-year-old boy coming in from school. What's going on? And he was playing a song called My Yiddische Mama by Sophie Tucker on the turntable. He was like, it's just about my mum. So yeah, he was a crier. We all are. We're all criers. I am. I cry, and I think my dad was the same. I grew up in Upper Norwood, southeast 19. I was born here in Brighton. And then family moved to Tooting, to Ullathorne Road when I was 3. So I must have been here till I was 3. And then from Ullathorne Road, we moved to Eversley Road in Upper Norwood. I had a lovely, I mean, it was a turbulent house, but it was a lot of fun, very loving, very close with my cousins, always saw my cousins, had very good friends, a lot of people around the house, a lot of parties, a lot of card games. I remember it very loving. My mum took me to the States. My mum did a bit of work in America and took me. My dad was a musician. He was a professional trombone player, played in a lot of the big bands, Sid Phillips and Sid Lawrence. And, you know, he was a jazz trombone player. But when he gave up playing the trombone, he became a demonstrator in exhibitions and agricultural shows. So he used to take me a lot, and markets. He used to take me a lot, and I used to love it. So I remember travelling a lot. It was good fun. He used to take me to things. I mean, you know, as you know, he passed away when I was 14. But we used to go on odd trips. Like, he used to take me a lot to London on a Sunday. We'd go to Feed the Pigeons, Trafalgar Square, and we'd go on the Serpentine. You know, maybe go on a rowing boat in Hyde Park. There's a really nice picture of my dad and I walking down Brighton Pier. My dad with a newspaper under his arm, probably turned to the horse racing section. So I just remember being with my dad a lot. You know, he did things with me. You know, he would be we were very close. My mum had left home, so I was living with my dad in a big detached house in Upper Norwood, and my dad drank every night. So he would go to the pub for probably an hour and leave me at home. I was probably 13. So this particular evening, he'd been to the pub, and I was waiting, and then I heard some scratching on the door. I opened the door, and my dad was asthmatic. He'd had a bad asthma attack. So we called the ambulance. The ambulance men came, they gave him oxygen and revived him. I think they wanted to take him in, from what I remember, to the hospital. But he didn't want to go, I think primarily because there was just him and I there. I think we had a dog, a greyhound dog at the time as well. And then I think it was the next night, or the next night after that, he didn't come back. And I was sat at the top of the stairs. We had the top of the stairs, you could look out of the window and you could see the street, the driveway and the street. And I just saw a police car pull up. And I just knew immediately that something bad had happened. So I remember running down, and my next door neighbour had come out somehow, or he was coming home, and we were very close with our neighbours. We'd lived there for so long. So he grabbed me, and the police came up and basically told me my dad had died. And then people just started arriving at the house, and I just remember sitting up all night with my cousin came round. She spoke, Selena, one of my cousins, spoke to me for ages. My mum came round, and, you know, it's just, you know, for a 14-year-old who idolised their father, you know, anyone who's had a parent die, it's just like a big earthquake or a crack appearing in the world, and, you know, it takes a long time to get over it. So that was that. It was quite traumatic. In fact, the whole trigger of the memory was going to the records office in the East End, and it brought it all back to me. My dad had a business partner, a guy called Teddy Surratt. My dad had a stall on Petticoat Lane Market that I went to look for, actually, when we went round, and Teddy came round and took me to Croydon to register the death It was either Apollo or Luna House, one of the Home Office buildings down there. And I remember now, I remember going in, I think you just filled a form out and you handed it in and you signed, and I think they gave you a copy. But I hadn't remembered that at all until I saw my first ever signature on the death certificate, which was traumatic to see that, because I just thought that was incredibly irresponsible of the adults around me at the time. I mean, that's younger than Jacob. Jacob's 15 and a half, and that's the last thing I would want him doing. But I suppose because my mum was probably out of the picture, I was considered the only available person. I don't know, but it was quite disturbing. It was very disturbing to see it.
Yeah, seeing my granddad's death certificate with my dad's signature on it when he was only 14 years old was quite emotional. I mean, I'm 15 and I couldn't imagine doing that a year ago.
Today, the Lubert family has spread over the UK, the US and Dubai. The family has grown and flourished over the past century, but it still retains its close connections. Danny and his wife Charlotte have 4 sons, Jacob, Joseph, Isaac and Solomon. The family, as it exists today, can trace its survival and success directly back to Joseph Monsieur. His journey ended 70 years ago, but the Lubert family's journey goes on.
I'm the type of person who likes to get to the bottom of everything. So I struggled with not being disappointed with the lack of information about my grandmother and the lack of clarity regarding Joseph and where he was from. But I've got to deal with that. So that brought that part of my personality up again, where I've just got to say, hold on, there's a great amount of information here. Everyone else thinks it's amazing. You know, stop, being too critical and too over-demanding. So it brought that up again for me, but it cleared up a lot. I feel a lot closer to Joseph Lubetsky, actually. And it's a complete coincidence that one of my sons is called Joseph. Complete coincidence. I wish I'd taken my wife with me. Even though she's not part of the bloodline, she is a Lubert, and I think I was out of line not wanting her to come, which I realised afterwards. She'd have really enjoyed it. I don't know what it's like to marry and take someone's name, but it might be worth finding a little bit out about the name you're taking. So I wish I'd taken her, and I hope I will take her back there at some point. I didn't bring my 3rd eldest son or my 2nd youngest son, Isaac, because we spoke with Sue and she didn't think it was appropriate. So I knew we were going to have some Holocaust stuff, and I felt confident Jacob and Joseph would be okay. I've taken them to some places in South Africa at orphanages and things like that where there's been some horror stories, so I knew they'd be okay.
Well, I think I've learned a lot educationally, and I think I've kind of, I'm now willing to share the story with the future generations of the Luberts. And I think I've learned to be grateful for what we have today, because we might not have made it had it not been for some of those Lubetskis who took some risks and made it out of the camp. Well, it made me value my family history a lot more. It made me realise how important it really should be to anyone, really, to know about their family. I mean, to think it was only 100 years ago and I had no idea of any of this was really something. Well, obviously Joseph's a lot younger, so I'd have expected him to have found it more difficult to comprehend. But by the end of the trip, I think he really took in some values that normally children won't get till they're much older. You know, experiencing death and how close it could be to people.
It's made me want to learn more, to be honest, so that's not such a good thing. I really want to find out about my grandmother. So a desire for more knowledge. It's answered a lot of questions. I feel much more peaceful about where we all come from. It's made me question religion again, which I've been doing all my life. And, you know, lovely to share that type of knowledge with my children, to see them growing, you know, with not just standard education they get at school, with just, you know, giving them something else. It's been fantastic to be able to do that.
He's my father, he's my dad, so it means a lot more to him because he's closer to the people. He's met some of the people, he's heard stories about some of the people, and it was really kind of his story that he shared with us. So he was a lot more emotional because it meant a lot more to him. But gradually as the trip went on, me and Joseph, you know, took it to heart.
What does it mean to be a Lubert? It's something to be very proud of. It's not being Jewish, it's being a Lubert. You know, that's something that we need to make a distinction, because otherwise we'll be non-Jewish Luberts, which is not the case. We're Luberts. I think we're successful people. I think we love our family and we help our family. All our families, not just Luberts, but, you know, our in-laws or whoever. We're a very close family. And the most important thing about being a Lubert of everything is you have to be an Arsenal supporter.
But it means you're really good at escaping from difficult situations. And it means that you're gonna survive. We're survivors.